What do I believe in? What do I value? These were a couple of questions I kept rolling around in my head the last couple weeks as I tried to come up with just the best TED speech idea I could come up with, and to pull together the best tidbit of wisdom to leave everyone in the class with. Now, I had quite a bit of trouble doing this, so I started to review my speeches I've given thus far throughout this quarter. In my first speech, I spoke about my life, past, present, and future, and how I believed that if we did all the things we're capable of, we could literally astound ourselves. In my second speech, I spoke about 8-year-olds, all the trouble 8-year-olds get into, and that I learned that you should always listen, you should always look out for danger, and that you should always be prepared for messes. In my third speech, I spoke about Winston Churchill and some interesting things that had happened in his life, and I mainly focused on the idea that we should put our blood, toil, tears, and sweat into everything we set ourselves to doing, that we should use that as our kind of standard for the effort we put into things. And finally, with our fourth speech, I decided to go against the grain and do something that I wasn't so confident in. I spoke about spontaneity, and I spoke about some of the adventures, good or bad, that a person could get into when they decide to live on the spontaneous side of life. After reviewing all the speeches I've given this quarter, I noticed a central idea that seemed to come out and kind of came up from the paper on each one of my speeches. And this idea is one that I've struggled to adopt myself, and I hope that some of you can pull the words from it and either adopt my personal interpretation of it or come up with your own. Living life without limits. Living life without limits. Living life without limits. This is a great phrase, I think. It really pulls together the idea of putting everything into every moment, but also to not even look at the boundaries, the goals, or the limits that you feel you have for yourself, and to just go at it without even considering that. Now, I will touch on 3 main points today. I will touch on 3 main points today. I will touch on how I have viewed this idea myself, and also the top 10 influential people who've never lived. I will talk about how public speaking relates to this idea of living life without limits. And finally, I will discuss how fear relates to this idea. So after I came up with this idea for living life without limits, there were some requirements to this speech. I had to pull in outside sources because my personal words, and even those of Phil Backlund with his PhD, would not be enough. So I found this amazing line called the top 10 influential people who never lived. And it's on a website called listverse or listuniverse.com. And they're pretty famous for making some of the coolest, most zany top 10 lists that are out there. And I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. I will go into a slight bit of detail on them, but again, there are 10 of them, so I want to keep it short. Drum roll, please. Thank you. Santa Claus, the fat man himself. If you've been good all year, you get some presents. If you haven't, you get a lump of coal. He represents this idea that there's a naughty and nice list, and that we should monitor ourselves for material goods. Barbie. I had trouble figuring out what Barbie represented, and I looked at their description and still had no idea. I hadn't played with Barbie as a kid. So I called up my mom and sister and asked them, get out of your system. I had not played with Barbie as a kid. So I called up my mom and sister and said, what does Barbie mean to you two, or to either of you? And the general idea I got from the two of them was Barbie represents a woman's independence from needing a man to support herself, and this idea that a woman can do anything she wants to. And that's what young girls have gotten from the idea of Barbie. Or at least that's what I gathered from it. Robin Hood. Exactly, Ronnie. Robin Hood is this idea that if we have overbearing taxes or rules or laws that are put over us that hold the common man down, we should fight against them, steal from the rich, and help out the poor. Cowboys. The idea of the lonely wanderer out in the wasteland with just him and his horse. protection of women and children, and also defense of justice. The Marlboro man. I practiced that for 24 hours and I still have trouble with it. And this is the saying, real men don't smoke cigarettes with filters. We don't need anything to stand between us and some rat poison and toxins. We can handle it. We're men. Rosie the Riveter. And this was the idea of women working in the traditional male workforce and being able to do it just as well as a man. Daedalus and Icarus. Now, I thought this one was a step back from the rest of the ones on the list. It got a little bit ancient Greece-ish, if you will. And I felt that this pulled on the idea of man's desire to flight. And I thought of all the things that have come from this. We've had helicopters, planes, jetpacks, that movie The Rocketeer, and all these other ideas like comics where men could just fly, like X-Men and things like that. The Little Engine That Could. Who can forget this book? I remember being read this by my kindergarten teacher when I was about 5 years of age. And The Little Engine That Could always represents the idea of perseverance, hard work, and the power of positive thinking. Big Brother. I had no idea what this was. I've never read 1984, so I had to do a ton of research on this. But what I came up with was government regulation, mental manipulation, and control. And finally, number 1, Romeo and Juliet. I don't know how to summarize this into a short phrase that hasn't already been said, because there's so many different themes that fall into the idea of Romeo and Juliet. So I just went with star-crossed lovers. And my relation to everyone here is, has anyone ever had those relationships that just don't seem to work out and no one agrees with? And that you really want to be there, but things just aren't going the way you're hoping? So when I looked at this list, I thought, I could motivate everyone. I could tell everyone a story about a time I was down in the dumps and how I've come from that. And I could be a narcissist. I could talk about some amazing accomplishments I feel I've made. But instead, I thought it'd be funny to show a list of people who never lived and yet have impacted our culture, our society, and how we view love, the idea of government versus people's freedom, the idea of equality, and all these other social concepts. And that would make a much better point. Next, I decided to tie it into our class. Public speaking. And I wanted to compare how public speaking relates to this idea of living life without limits. Now, public speaking has been a class where I've had to learn how to push my limits. Before I came into this class, I was quite confident in my public speaking abilities. I had taken 3 public speaking classes in community college and done pretty well. And I'd also taken a couple public speaking classes here. So I thought this was going to be an easy A. But little did I know, Mr. Dr. Backlund over there had many different ideas other than giving anyone an easy A in this class. For example, our second speech assignment was the exaggeration for effect. We had to talk about something, but we couldn't just give a speech. We had to push ourselves. We had to exaggerate. We had to bring in props. We had to engage with the audience. And this speech pushed me because I wrote on my initial sheet that came for the introduction speech, I'm really looking forward to the exaggeration speech because I don't exaggerate anything in my speeches, but I'm not going to touch anyone, and I don't want to get too close to anybody. I'm not comfortable with that, Phil, and I'm going to do amazing, but I'm not going to do those things. And it was funny to see his response to it, of course. And again, I just felt that public speaking really engages what I believe life to be, because there's this eternal struggle for living in the moment. Because when you're up here for your 5 to 7 minutes, everyone is focusing on you. You have a chance to speak about what you care about, what's deep down within your thoughts, your feelings, perhaps your insecurities, and also topics of life and death, which have often come up in this class. And finally, public speaking to me is a challenge. Because as I said, we have 5 to 7 minutes up here to make an impact on everyone else. And if there are 5 speeches in this class, and there's about 20 of us, give or take, that means we have a chance of 5% of making an impact on everyone else, approximately, out of 100 speeches, which is not easy, because if you have to watch 95 other speeches, those aren't the best odds. And finally, my final point is, how does fear relate to all of this? Now, I was looking into public speaking fears, and there is an official phobia. We've all heard the statistic that 75% of all people are more afraid of public speaking than death itself, or the idea of dying. And there are statistical backing ups of this. I went to speechtopicshelp.com, and the name for the fear of public speaking is called glossophobia. Like glossary and then phobia at the end. And this actually is the greatest fear that people have. It's the idea of getting up in front of people and asserting yourself to an audience. It is indeed higher than necrophobia, which is, of course, the fear of death or the idea of thinking about dying. And I found it ironic because we get up here and we give our speeches. You know, we're nearly about to graduate, and we're terrified, and we've had so many speeches about the unknown, the fact that we're going to graduate and have to go out into the world, get a job, and worry about all these things. And that all the same, death is supposed to be comparably scarier than even that. And I thought if we give these speeches and we talk about things that are deeply important to us, about life and about death, and we live in the moment for the 5 to 7 minutes we're up here, then haven't we already discussed life? And haven't we already discussed death? So how can those things be scary? Because that's all we've pretty much talked about this entire quarter. Our experiences of the loss and how we redeemed ourselves from a tough situation. We talked about tough roommate situations. We talked about teen pregnancy possibilities. And we talked about trying to prevent the Pearl Harbor attack. So what else could there possibly be that's out there that we could be scared of at this point? And this was what was weighing on my mind, because I feel that we should always go after everything that we can possibly imagine, and even then some. Don't actually have per se a goal, as Griffin said. A list of goals is great, but I feel that if you have a goal, then you stop at that point. The same idea with if you get grades on things, you only go to the point that the grade is worth. So in conclusion, live life without limits. Live life without limits. I have shared some ideas about what I feel this means, and also what the top 10 influential people who never lived have done to our culture and how we see many basic social concepts. I've discussed how public speaking relates to all these ideas, and I've also talked about how fear puts its 2 cents into this idea. I wanted to leave you with one final quote by C. Joywell C. A lifetime isn't forever, so take the first chance. Don't wait for the second one, because sometimes there aren't second chances. And if it turns out to be a mistake, so what? This is life. A whole bunch of mistakes. But if you never get a second chance to do what you didn't take a first chance at, that's true failure. Thank you.